In the 19th century, Britain propelled itself to be the largest colonial force on the planet, acquiring 400,000 square miles in the 100 years, causing it to be now known as Britain's Imperial Age, despite the peak of the empire being in 1924, where it famously covered a fifth of the world's population and landmass. The colonization of India, Canada, Burma, Hong Kong, Singapore, Egypt, the scramble for Africa, and numerous other countries now officially brought the empire back into existence, whereas before it was largely degraded after the American War of Independence, in which Britain lost 13 colonies, which would become the United States. The 19th century for Britain also meant massive cultural changes, as foreign imports were now more accessible. More people were moving around the vast empire, and many pieces of literature characterized the period. Sherlock Holmes and his trusted companion, Dr. John Watson, have been on adventure after adventure, 60 of them to be precise, and the consultant detective has seen many TV adaptations, films, plays, fan fictions, and other reincarnations over the years, making Holmes among the most beloved character of any literature, and easily amongst the most recognizable. In fact, the word fan, meaning fanatic, came into existence following the never-seen-before public reactions to the stories. To prove just how popular Sherlock Holmes was, the original author, Arthur Conan Doyle, reluctantly picked up his pen to think up another great crime which his detective will solve with remarkable skill. Arthur Conan Doyle never wanted to produce as many Sherlock Holmes stories. You can sort of tell by reading them that he means it to be the last one. He even went so far as to kill him off in Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Final Problem, and then he was still so popular that he firstly wrote loads of other short stories which would be in between the years of 1887 with this Study in Scarlet and his death with the Final Problem, and then he even went as far as to bring him back into the realm of the living, which, must have shocked the fans a bit. I kind of want to go back in time and see that. But anyway, with Sherlock Holmes, with great popularity becomes great influence. But before we'll get into that, here's a fun fact about Doyle. He was a spiritualist, and when 5 photos of little girls next to fairies were brought to his attention, he wrote an article about the phenomena, fully believing in the little creatures' existence. The ones I could probably find out a way to put them up with the power of editing, and they do look just like Tinkerbell. However, sadly for Doyle, but probably predictably for people today, with the amount of skepticism which is needed when you see a photo, especially of a little winged creature, the Cottonley fairies, as come to be known, taken in 1917, were proved to be fake. Now, so that's just a little fun fact about the author, but Holmes, however, is sort of on the edge of serious literature and popular culture. But one thing is for certain, no matter what genre it is that his influence reached far more over 221B Baker Street. And the world which Conan Doyle presents of him scouring for clues either in the grimy streets of London or the vast moors of Dartmoor, you can always see Conan Doyle's political views, the social situation of the time, and just the general climate of the Victorian era. And I think this will be greatly summed up in the attitudes to empire, which are presented through the 56 short stories and 4 novels. So, in the Victorian period, the British Empire commanded over 450 million people and held 14 million square miles. It is often assumed but everyone in Britain, or everyone native to Britain, felt unquestionable patriotism towards the great overseas empire. However, in many cases, the opposite is actually the true. Well, not the exact opposite, but a lot of working class people didn't really care about the empire. You can see the Indian Mutiny of 1857, people weren't so jingoist as people often assume today. Jingoism roughly meaning a sort of nationalism, which is those damn enemies, those foreign enemies, we'll send an army over there and we'll do it British style, hurrah! That's sort of a gist of jingoism. But yes, although increasingly more people were having, say, tea or sugar or tobacco or other colonial goods, that does not really mean that they actually cared that much about the empire, because they, especially by the 20s, the UK government had to put in Empire Day, or didn't have to, obviously, but they put in Empire Day and for schools, Empire Day for schools, which the students will celebrate, and some families back home celebrated it too, but not many, and the British Empire exhibition, which would be on the grounds of which will become Wembley Stadium, in which the national England team plays football if it's home, and I believe the FA Cup is also in Wembley, so it's got some nice history. And that was opened in 1924, so around about when the British Empire was at its territorial peak, although we know that the economy surrounding the empire was sort of dwindling. It wasn't so stable. But yes, although especially the British Empire exhibition worked, it was planted or commissioned, and I suppose I should give some context to what the Empire exhibition actually was. It was basically just a festival of the empire. There were loads of different presentations and exhibitions, believe it or not, of all the different cultures and people and religions they had control over, and surprise surprise, a lot of it was quite racist, particularly in terms of Africa, when, you know, they see mud huts and cannibals, and that's not really the case of what the vast majority of Africans were. I just suppose I should clear that up, that Africans are not cannibals and they do not live in mud huts. So yes, although it did have millions upon millions of visitors, it was added to boost morale or relevance of the empire to ordinary people, because a lot of people didn't really care about colonial news. In fact, during World War II, a lot more people were interested in news about the Soviets and the Americans rather than colonial news. But anyway, that's not really the point. So, in the latter half of the 19th century especially, after the dissolution of the East India Company, many people visited different colonies, and this is whether by permanently immigrating, particularly to the dominions of South America, Canada, Australia. They were mostly the ones where British people went over to permanently settle, or working for a few years, or just taking a tour of the empire. People did move around regularly. And these are just to the empire, let alone other parts of the world like the United States or Southern America or Asia or Europe. A lot of people, particularly the middle and upper classes, just went all around the world in this time. So people moving and coming back into the country, particularly around metropolitan areas like London, it is a very common place. It wasn't really that much of a big deal. However, Arthur Conan Doyle, or ACD as I will probably most most commonly refer to him now, most of his villains were British people who had just come back from colonies, and often they would have some sort of defect or some sort of peculiarity about him, such as a crooked soldier who would have what we would now see as PTSD, or someone returning from India with a mongoose pet, or Jack Stapleton, the villain in Hound of the Baskervilles. I suppose I should have given a spoiler warning, but it is over 100 years old. It was written in 1902. But yes, he pretended that his wife was actually his sister, which is a bit odd, to try and hide their identity. I can't really remember why, but yes, such consistency of the character of being a colonial and having some sort of reason for people to mistrust them or see them as strange. It's peculiarly consistent in Doyle's works, or Sherlock Holmes' works. Obviously, he was a serious writer as well. He tried to write a lot of historical fiction, but as it turned out, Sherlock Holmes would always come back to prove to be his most popular franchise or books. So yes, ACD clearly doesn't have an anti-patriotic view or an anti-colonial view. However, he does not really embrace imperialism with such fervour as a lot of people would expect of him. But as I said, he did serve in he didn't serve in Egypt. He was in Cairo to see his wife, and then he signed up to be a war journalist, but then he had to go back sooner than expected, so he didn't actually see combat in Egypt. But in the Boer Wars, he did serve as a army surgeon or doctor. I've always noticed how him, the author himself, and John Watson are peculiarly similar. Both were doctors in the army coming back to London and want a relatively quiet life, and we can't forget the moustache. That's quite a striking resemblance. So yes, Doyle was definitely a patriot, and he did support the Empire. However, I would describe him as more of a conservative in terms of his views for it, because he admired Old England, quotes, which is quite a mythic scene. I mean, such representations didn't really happen in the times of old in England, so but that's a lot of it. Like, he was worried about, well, what's going to happen in a few years when we have this massive empire? Is something wrong going to happen to us? Which never really happened. There were obviously rebellions here and there, but the actual state of Britain was never seriously contended. Actually, I say that, but Ireland does exist. But Ireland is sort of a different topic anyway, although it is very connected to imperialism. It wasn't really the same as imperialism back in those days. People didn't see Ireland as a colony. Yes, served in the Boer War, in which he didn't have a very good time, and he wrote a Sherlock Holmes story based in the Boer War. So I think I will do this to sort of as a sign of his, or Sherlock Holmes's, presentation of empire, because it's always noted in all of the books. It's like across all the corners of the empire and stuff like that. So it's not absent by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not really put to the forefront of absolutely everything, as some people would like to imagine, or do imagine, what would actually happen in Victorian Britain. So the adventure of the blanched soldier, or the blanched soldier. I just remembered I didn't look up how to pronounce that. I'll say blanched. So yes, the plot is basically a Boer War veteran comes to Sherlock Holmes because his friend, who is also a veteran of the Boer War, Godfrey Emsworth, has gone missing. And then the plot continues. They find him, or they spot him from afar. I believe it's in the countryside. And then the day afterwards they go up to him because he seems out of place. Like, there was a quote in there, like, it was not just that he was pale as cheese. I don't know why Doyle decided to say pale as cheese, which sort of shone in the moonlight, and he also looked very terrified, but he also said that there was something else about him which he didn't quite know, which made him look particularly worrisome. So then they asked him what it was, and this is what it was. It's how he, or the character Godfrey Emsworth, woke up in a leprosy hospital in Africa during the war, surrounded by Dutch-speaking Boers, and they attack him, laughing as they draw blood from his wounds, which he was in the hospital for. So yes, and it's very important that this was placed in a hospital, because obviously ACD served in the hospitals during the Boer War, and which actually served him to be knighted was because of his small group of staff's fervent work during a typhoid epidemic. So he was pretty much working night and day in a war zone, treating people with typhoid. So, and obviously he supported the Boer War, because much with a lot of parts of society and British Empire particularly, especially the foreign wars which seemed endless, just going on and on and on in new parts of the world which Britain wants, or colonies which they already had which are kicking up a fuss. Just all the wars kept on going on and on and on, so people, especially with the Boer War, questioned the legitimacy of the whole thing. But ACD, he wrote a pamphlet, apparently, according to a source, but it is as long as a book, but apparently it's a pamphlet, which he did in a week, in which he defended basically everything which was going on in the Boer War, because he came back, thought the war would be shortly over, but then it continued. I'm not an expert on the Boer War by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of people, as I said, questioned the legitimacy, and he defended it as well as he could. So, and as much as he could, he wholeheartedly believed in the civilizing mission, or whatever it was. Yes, and it is also important to note, in terms of such colonials returning home, that imperial control varied between colony to colony. For example, in India, there was much more military focus, or much more authoritarian nature to the British rule, to say Canada. And there are obviously other historical and cultural and other contexts behind A, the colonisation of that place, B, how long ago it was, and C, what's actually happening there. Is it just a place like India where they said in the early days, oh, it's to civilise the people, and then when they realised, oh, these people don't like being turned into Christians, we're going to set up mercantile trading, and then when mercantilism sort of went down, it's to spread liberal capitalism now, until they officially colonised it in 1859, after the Indian Mutiny was all sorted out, quote, mutiny anyway, but will become a bit more important in a later date. Well, not a later date, hopefully it will be still today. But yes, in The Adventure of the Glorious Scot, one of the characters who, again, well, not really the villain, but he's at the centre of a plot. He just came back from Australia. And obviously, Australia was a penal colony until 1868, so very recently. Only about 20-30 odd years after this short story was written. So a lot of the readers assumed, or likens, Australia and prison, so they will naturally be mistrustful of certain characters. And yes, this character, Justice Trevor, was the father of one of Sherlock Holmes's friends, even though later Sherlock Holmes says he hasn't got any friends other than John Watson, which was very wholesome 100. Yes, it turns out that Justice Trevor was a criminal, and this sort of portrays two sides of the 19th century migration, because on one hand there's the father who went out to Australia, he became a criminal and didn't really make much use to himself, and so then he came back home. In this instance, he didn't become a criminal back home. It was that someone came back and blackmailed him, like saying, I know you were a criminal in Australia, and then he died of a stroke a few days later because of it. So, it's just the general plot, I believe so anyway. So yeah, in that instance, he wasn't actually a criminal in the British Isles, at least. And then there's his son, who went off some other place, made vast riches for himself, came back home and was going to buy an estate and build a house and the like. So we can see from Doyle's perspective that a good colonial is one who goes out but keeps British traditions and makes himself rich and then comes back to then spend the money in the British Isles and build a house and provide for their British family. Now, it is also important to note that sort of some of what I've just said, it may be interpreted to be sort of anti-capitalism. Well, not really anti-capitalism, but the fact that a respectable family can fall so rapidly, like the old England, the old way of things, where it was based around who your family was, that was getting broken down by increasing use of capitalism. So it can be seen as anti-capitalistic, but it is also important to know that most of the clients which Sherlock Holmes treats are middle or upper class. I mean, he even served Bohemian royalty in... no, I can't forget it now. The one with Irene Adler. I tend to have to Sherlock Holmes, Irene Adler book. A Scandal in Bohemia. That's it. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, so most of his clients aren't actually focused around the workers or the labouring poor, who are actually, well, I'll say this with a pinch of salt, but most badly affected by capitalism, because obviously materially their lives improved, but they also had to work about 60 hours a week, had no food mostly. So yeah, their lives improved and GDP did go up, but most of the production was by the rich anyway, and they were getting exploited, there's no denying that. And Sherlock Holmes presents conservatism towards the empire in a different way too. Obviously, it's a crime novel or a detective novel, which would spawn a lot more different novels and genres of other writers, but Sherlock Holmes will reign supreme, at least in the public image today. Maybe in another 100 years people would have forgotten about Sherlock Holmes and moved to another, but so far he is as I said at the beginning, one of the most successful literary characters of all time. But yes, I touched on it earlier, but in The Sign of the Four, one of the Darn villains speaks of the Great Mutiny of 1857, and I have a quote here. "Well, I was never in luck's way long. Suddenly, without a note or warning, the Great Mutiny broke out upon us. 1 month India lay as still and peaceful, to all appearance, as Surrey or Kent. The next there were 200,000 black devils let loose, and the country was a perfect hell." So yeah, ignoring the blatant racism of calling them the so-called mutineers black demons. I will further go on to say why that is important. Because the mutiny of 1857 was not a mutiny at all. Not only is a mutiny only on board, say, some sailors overthrow their captain, that's a mutiny, but I suppose you could put it into, okay, a few regiments of an infantry division rebel, it can be called as a mutiny, which I get. But then, if you go after the first few months of the conflict, Bahadur Shah II, who is the last Mughal emperor, agrees to be the emperor of the mutineers. And then in Awadh especially, which was recently annexed in 1856, and still had a queen, the Queen or Rani of Shansi, most of the fighting there was conducted by peasants, not sepoys. Sepoys being the basically private soldiers of the East India Company, recruited from the natives, who were still considered by one historian I've read as peasants in uniform. So, it's not a mutiny. It's definitely not an Indian War of Independence, but it's not a mutiny. So yeah, but anyway, the finer details of the mutiny isn't really the point I'm getting at. The point is that Holmes and the characters just accept that, okay, it was a mutiny, the government says it's a mutiny, therefore it's a mutiny, even though he literally says in the same sentence that there were 200,000 of them. Doesn't sound much like a mutiny. But, yeah, so why, back to the point of some colonials being seen as mistrusted by Doyle and some other people of the time. Well, the answer could be for, quote, poor whites, because, especially in India, why did the East India Company restrict so much access to India, unless if they're in the British Army or they worked for the company? Why did they stop so many people emigrating to India? Well, there is one quote from 1867, obviously after the company had been broken apart, by a British official, and he says, "The sight of Europeans in total degradation," I've paraphrased this a bit, "the sight of Europeans in total degradation must tend to degrade our race in the eyes of all who see them." So you can see how a lot of people in the colonies, they wanted only successful white people there, because that upholds the image of racial superiority. If all the natives see is rich, successful white people, they're not going to question it as much. But if they see a load of poor white people and white people begging on the street wearing native clothes, they're going to realise, hang on a minute, they're just like us, they're not all naturally successful, we should probably not have another race rule over us. So, although Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of a Yellow Face, I think that's what it's called, in which the plot is basically someone's wife is acting all suspicious, he he sees his wife in a house which until recently has just been empty, and someone has just bought it. So he goes over to it, and in the window he sees a horrible yellow face, like a ghost, and then it disappears. So then he gets Sherlock Holmes. It's actually one of my more favourite short stories. It's about an hour of an audiobook. So yes, and the plot is that basically Sherlock Holmes gets it wrong. He says that the man with the yellow face must be the wife's ex-husband, who he told her current husband died in a fire in America, and he's obviously came back, and because he has the best dream, he deduces that, okay, he's threatening them, because otherwise he wouldn't have a best dream. But then it turns out, as John Watson is the husband and Sherlock go into the house, it's not actually a husband come back from the United States, it's actually the wife's child, and that child is a black child, because it was little known before, but the husband was of African descent. Although it does say something about the treachery of her race, or something like that. It is presented as a good thing that the husband still accepts it as his daughter. So hooray, it's racist but sort of not. So yeah, so these quote poor whites would come back to England and be seen as a menace to some people, and as I said, would deconstruct the lie of racial superiority. So this, I feel like this has been quite a short one. So I suppose in conclusion, I suppose a pre-word, I was going to make this Sherlock Holmes and Victorian Politics. That's what I've titled the document as. But as I was writing the script, I know I actually did write a script this time. I wondered. No, I didn't wonder. Why did I say wondered? I realised that this was a lot of information, but I suppose as I'm reading it from about 5 different articles, all of which at least 10 pages long, that I know, it's far too much. But it would obviously seem as a lot more work as I'm reading through it and then taking sparse notes than just the notes on its own when I will be recording it. So I sort of apologise, I suppose. But it is still a 36 minutes long video. If you want more of me, well, then you're probably insane. So yes, maybe I should have made it to politics as well, and social issues. That would be interesting, actually. Social issues, Victorian social questions, particularly poverty and the like. So anyway, in conclusion of Sherlock Holmes and attitudes to the British Empire, Holmes stands in his iconic deerstalker hat, his pipe and his magnifying glass, somewhere between patriotism and apathy, between ignorance and seemingly omnipotent and boundless knowledge. He is both the upholder of social values and the violator of every social norm. He says he studies the criminal's mind, but in reality he studies their social status. He looks at their wealth, who they love, and form a theory on their motives. Politics are never the centre of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Well, a few of them, like the adventure of a naval treaty, and can't remember what it's called, but the one in which the Prime Minister's documents get stolen and it turns out to be just the wife stealing it, which I suppose sort of may say something about women's suffrage as well. How shouldn't really be trusted, or they're too emotionally driven to be involved by politics, supposedly. Yes, although politics is never the centre of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, as Thomas Love Peacock says, I didn't know whether to include love in his name, but that's what it says, so. The moral and political character of the age or nation may be read by an by an attentive observer, even in its slightest literature. Which I think is definitely very true, because as I said before, it's not really considered serious literature. So in a way it is light literature. I mean, a lot of them were just short stories, so it's not really, I don't know, would Narnia be popular culture? I'm not really an expert for Victorian literature. Say Oliver Twist or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that's the one I'm thinking of. Or Dr. Jekyll, I don't know how to say it to this day. It was boiled to me, by the way. I feel like this needs more comedy in this video, so there I was reading it. For some reason I have no idea what it was about, so I started reading it and I was like, you know, this is very good. Started speaking to my mum about it, don't ask why, but I just was. Then she's like, oh yeah, isn't it like in the moonlight he turns into Mr. Hyde? And I'm just like, well, I'm only a few pages in, I thought it was very good, and now I know the ending, don't want to know it, so ever since I haven't read another word, and I've tried to forget it, but obviously the more you think of something to forget it, ironically, the more it comes into your mind, so, you know, a bit salty on that one still. So yeah, Sherlock Holmes, we see pride in the Empire, we see patriotism, we see love for the Queen, we see love for the institutions. However, Sherlock Holmes sometimes breaks the law to find evidence. He sometimes doesn't report things to the police, or Dr. Watson in his chronicle of the stories, he doesn't give the name of the place or stall to save it from scandal, so they're not completely moral themselves either, let alone Sherlock Holmes was a cocaine addict. At the end of the Sign of the Four, I just realised I have it up on here, the PDF, for free obviously. I'm not that stupid to actually buy something when it's free online. Is it not the Sign of the Four, where he says, for me it is like what Watson says, I have a wife out of all of this. Oh, whatever Mary's surname is, he has his treasure back. Lestrade has a fascinating case which he can claim. What's in it for his? What's in it for you? And for me, said Sherlock Holmes, there still remains the cocaine bottle, and he stretched his long white hand up for it. Hooray, he's still a cocaine addict. Woo. So yeah, yeah, there is a particular sense of Britishness in every Sherlock Holmes novel or short story, and most of the villains are poor British people, or implied with some Indians or the like, but most of them are poor. Some of them are businessmen, such as Charles Augustus Milverton Smith, which must just be Culverton Smith in the BBC Sherlock. A few captains, such as the one, was the one where it's the one with the wine and the beeswax, where there's 3 bottles of 3 glasses of wine left, which the supposed burglars break in, but only one of them has beeswax in it, or beeswin, sorry, not beeswax. You don't really need to know, but trust me, the captain is at the centre of it, though he's not really a bad guy. And high status women as well, like Irene Adler, though she is in one singular book for like 2 pages. But I've never understood why people love her so much. Like, how is she such an important character to be in like every single adaptation? I suppose it's because she's rumoured to be with Sherlock somehow. Oh yes, and the most crucial villain of all in the saga, evil mastermind, mathematics professors. Look out for them. Never trust a mathematics person, because they might throw you off a Switzerland, I think it's Swiss waterfall, Reichenbach Falls. Yeah, so don't trust them. If you go to the Crown Jewels and someone stands into The Thieving Magpie by Rossini, and he starts a piece of gum and a diamond and a fire extinguisher, just run, and you don't want to miss him. But anyway, that should be it. And any questions, queries, anxieties, as my previous module professor would say. Well, not really. No one calls them professors. Lecturers would say, and then she'd wait a few seconds and say, no, okay, great, you can go. Oh, good old days. Anyway, goodbye.